So, welcome to today's video. We're about 70-ish days out from the election, and I'm going to try to do my best to show you the state of play in every single state that is a battleground or a likely state. So, I'm just going to start off by shading in the safe states. So, that's going to be Washington, Oregon, California, New Mexico, Colorado, Illinois, New York, Vermont, Maine at large, Maine's first district, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, and DC. Oh, sorry, not Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is a toss-up. So that's going to be 211 for the Democrats. And for the Republican Party, there's going to be Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska at large, Nebraska's first district, Nebraska's third district, Iowa, Kansas, Utah, Oklahoma, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, Indiana, West Virginia, and Alaska. These are states that are going to go to either party by more than 10 points. So those are results that aren't really going to change. We can go into the likely states really quickly as well. For the Democratic Party, there's going to be Minnesota. So Minnesota is the state where Governor Tim Walz, who is the vice presidential candidate, is from. It went to Biden by around 7.5 points. I don't think it will go to Kamala Harris and Tim Walz by more than 10 points. So I'm going to characterize it as likely. It's probably going to be an 8-9 point margin. That's kind of what the polls say right now. Another likely state for the Democrats is New Hampshire. New Hampshire used to be kind of a swing state, but it's gotten more reliably Democratic over the past few cycles. And the last likely vote for the Democratic Party is Nebraska's second district. That went to Biden by a pretty comfortable margin, and the polls currently have Kamala up by a pretty sizable lead. So it's not a very big stretch to say that it will go to the Democratic Party by a likely margin. For the Republican Party, the likely states are Ohio. Ohio was a swing state for a very long time, but it's been trending more Republican recently. And so I think Ohio, just like in 2020 when it went to Trump by around 8 points, I think it's going to go to Trump again by a similar margin. And of course, it helps that J.D. Vance, Trump's vice presidential candidate, is from Ohio. And another likely state is Florida. Florida, again, like Ohio, used to be a swing state, but it's been trending very Republican recently. And so Trump went from winning very narrowly in 2016 by around 1.2 points to going to Trump by 3.6 in 2020. And I think it'll go to Trump by maybe 5-6 points now. That would make a lot of sense. Current Governor Ron DeSantis won in an absolute landslide in 2022. The Republican Party controls both of the Senate seats. The polls kind of have it going to the Republican Party by a likely margin, so I don't think that's going to change. Another likely state is South Carolina. South Carolina is a reliably Republican state, but it usually goes to Trump by maybe 9, 10, 11 points. I'm just going to characterize it as a likely state because it's not as solid as these other states. So that leaves us with a few more states that we can characterize for the Republican Party as lean states. So that's going to be, for now, that's going to be Maine's second district. Trump actually won Maine's second district by around 7-8 points in 2020 and by 10 in 2016. But polls currently have Kamala up, although there's only been one poll done. It was by the University of New Hampshire, which is very accurate in the New England region. I still think that that's a bit too far. I think Maine's second district will go to Trump, but by a much smaller margin than it previously went to him by. Another lean state is Texas. Texas was a very Republican state for a very long time, but it's been trending towards the Democratic Party for the past few cycles now. It went from going to Mitt Romney by a very large margin, like 16, 17 points, to going to Trump by 9 in 2016, and then to Trump again in 2020, but this time by 5.6 points, which is a very significant decrease from where it used to be. So that's the current state of play. The Democratic ticket has 226 electoral votes, and the Republican ticket has 219. There's 7 battleground states that I want to talk about today that are really going to define the election because of how the politics of this country are polarized. There really won't be a massive landslide like there was in 1964 with Lyndon B. Johnson or 1984 with Ronald Reagan. So it will really come down to these 7 states. And the first 3 that I want to talk about are Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, because those 3 have been part of the blue wall, but they voted for Trump in 2016, and they pretty much got Trump into the White House. And so I'm going to start with Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania went to Biden by 1.2 points in 2020 after going to Trump by 0.7 in 2016. And this is a state that had been reliably Democratic like Wisconsin and Michigan for around the past 20 years, but it's gotten more narrow. It's gotten much more narrow. And this should be a sign of worry for the Democratic Party in Pennsylvania, but there are signs that the Democratic Party is recovering in the state. So the first thing that I want to touch on in Pennsylvania is that Pennsylvania is a very interesting state. It has a lot of very large minority groups that are not really that prevalent in other states, and especially in other swing states. But it's also diverse. It has the eastern part, which is near the coast, but then it has the rural western part. And the current governor, Josh Shapiro, was one of the finalists to be the vice president, but Kamala Harris didn't choose him. She ended up going with Tim Walz, which honestly is probably the safer option. But Josh Shapiro, he actually won his election by 14.8 points in 2022, which is a very impressive margin, but it would make sense when you consider that his opponent, Doug Mastriano, is considered to be a pretty extreme candidate and is very controversial in many of his remarks and in many of the things that he says. And so the margin that Shapiro won by makes more sense when you consider that. And that actually ended up dragging down other Republican candidates like Dr. Oz, who was running for Senate against John Fetterman. He was up in the polling averages, but when election day came, he lost by 5 points. And the polls currently have Kamala Harris up in Pennsylvania by around 1.5 points. So that's putting it to around where it was in 2020, which would honestly make sense. It would make sense for Pennsylvania to go to the Democratic Party by a similar margin. However, I think if the election were held today, it would be a little bit more narrow. I think Pennsylvania would go to Kamala Harris by a tilt margin. So that's going to be between 0 and 1 percentage points, probably around what Trump won it by in 2016. There's 3 minorities that I really want to talk about in a lot of these states. The first one is the Arab American minority, which has been making a lot of headlines, especially during the primaries when Joe Biden was still in the race, that they wanted to abstain from voting and just, in their words, punish Joe Biden for what is going on right now in Gaza. So if all of the Arab Americans were to stay home in Pennsylvania and not vote, that's estimated to be anywhere between 60,000 and 180,000 people. So Pennsylvania does have a pretty significant Arab American minority. It's not as significant as it is in Michigan, which I'm going to get to in a little bit, but it is pretty significant enough to where it could tilt the election. However, with Kamala Harris now on the ticket, there's not that same type of pushback from that community, so it remains to be seen how that minority is going to affect the race. Another minority that I want to talk about that is most prevalent in Pennsylvania of these 7 states is the Ukrainian American minority. So Russia has been invading Ukraine for the past 2.5 years now. And a lot of politicians in the Republican Party have cast doubt on Ukraine's ability to fight back on whether the United States should continue to provide aid for Ukraine. And I feel like that could have a big swing on the Ukrainian American minority, which is traditionally a more conservative demographic. It could lead to them just staying home. It could lead to them flipping their tickets. But there's been some activism, especially in Pennsylvania, among the Ukrainians, that the Republican Party is not exactly on their side. And so I think it's very important to consider what the Ukrainians in Pennsylvania could do with this election, considering that they number at 120,000, around 100,000, 120,000-ish, which is a pretty big chunk. It's almost as big as the Arab American high estimate, which is pretty significant. The last minority that I want to talk about is the Polish American minority. They are, in Pennsylvania, 750,000 people. A lot of people in the United States can actually claim Polish ancestry. It is a very significant demographic. It is the largest Slavic demographic in the United States by a wide margin. But they are considered to be a very important swing demographic, and they have not voted for the wrong candidate since 1980, which is very significant. They have voted right every single year. They went to Trump by more than 15 points in 2016, but then they went to Biden by 12 in 2020. So I think that they could have an enormous sway on the election in Pennsylvania and in a lot of other states too, because Poland traditionally has a very negative view of Russia, very negative view of Russian wars, Russian expansionism. So that remains to be seen how it will unfold, especially given Trump's friendliness towards the Russian dictator and his openness to ending the conflict and forcing Ukraine to give up land. Although Poland isn't exactly the most friendly country with Ukraine, I think that that could affect even just a little bit, even just for a small minority of the Polish voters. But I think that that effect will be seen in 2024, even if it's just small. It will be less significant than what the effect will be on the Ukrainian minority, but I think it will still be there and it will still be felt. Moving over to Michigan, it went to Biden by 2.8 points in 2020. And it was actually Trump's narrowest victory in 2016 when he won it by 0.23 percentage points, which is very slim, very slim. The Democrats actually performed very well in Michigan and defied the national swing towards the Republican Party and ended up winning the governorship, which was Gretchen Whitmer. She won re-election by 10.5 points against Tudor Dixon, who, like Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania, was also pretty controversial, not as controversial as him, but still somewhat controversial and somewhat unpopular, to the point where she actually ended up dragging down all of the other Republicans in the state. And so the Democratic Party won control of the Michigan legislature in full for the first time since 1984, which is very significant when you think about it, because this was a year when the president's party did very well in a state, did better than it should have. But the state is probably the most Democratic leaning out of the three Rust Belt states that I'm covering right now. But I still think that it will be close. I don't think it will be as close as Pennsylvania, but I think it will be pretty close. I think Michigan will go to Kamala Harris by a lean margin. That's going to be between 1 and 5 points. I think what the polls say, which is around 3 right now, I think that sounds about right. I think maybe it could go up to 3.5. That's probably what it will be. But I think Michigan goes blue in 2024, like it did in 2020, like it did for most of this century. And again, the Arab American vote will be very significant in Michigan. So Michigan has the largest by percentage community of Arab Americans in the United States. They are between 154,000 and 500,000. They're estimated to be 1.5 to 3% of the state's population. I think the 500,000 number is a bit high, but the point is, it is a very significant community, and the uncommitted vote in Michigan during the primaries was around 10 to 15%, which is pretty high. And now with Kamala Harris, that same thing doesn't apply. We've seen in polls that Kamala Harris has a better favorability than Joe Biden. She has a better favorability than even Donald Trump. And that's very significant because it means that people aren't associating her with the grievances that they have against the Biden administration, which is kind of counterintuitive when you think about it, because she can tout the record, but people won't associate her with all of the things that they see negatively around Joe Biden, regardless of if they are his fault or not, like inflation, like Gaza, a bunch of that stuff. It's really interesting to see that phenomenon currently going on. It's not as much as it is in Pennsylvania for the Ukrainian community. They number at around 35 to 40,000, so not a lot, but I think it could tilt the election because, again, this election is really a battle of margins. The margins for each state, the margins for each demographic, margins for every single community, really. Still, I think those 35 to 40,000 people could tilt the election, maybe tilt a few House races. If it would be closer, then they would have a more outsized impact. I don't think that they will play a pivotal role in the election in Michigan, but they are there. Another demographic, like in Pennsylvania, Michigan also has a very large Polish American minority, around 8% of the population and around 800,000 people. So that's actually a very significant number. And that could also tilt the election in Kamala Harris's favor if the Democrats get behind Ukraine in a more major way. I mean, of course, the Democratic Party is pretty much the only one actively advocating for more aid to Ukraine at this point in time. And the Republican Party, again, like I said with Pennsylvania, they have been very skeptical of Ukraine. And if the Democrats can tie the Republican Party to Russia in these states, I think that they will have a better chance of winning these states by better margins, or just winning these states. If these polls are off, maybe they are like they were in 2020. Maybe they are like they were in 2016. But if the polls are accurate, maybe they could go higher. I don't see it going much higher. But still, I think that those three minorities also something to consider in Michigan. Finally, for the Great Lakes states, we have Wisconsin. Wisconsin was very narrow in 2020, went to Biden by 0.63 points, which is not a lot. It's more narrow than Michigan, it's more narrow than Pennsylvania. And Trump also won it by a very similar margin in 2016. But this is a state that is very competitive. The midterms were also competitive. The incumbent senator, Republican Ron Johnson, ended up winning re-election by exactly 1 point in 2022. And the Democratic Governor Tony Evers also won re-election by around 4 points, even though the polls had his opponent up by around a point and a half. He ended up winning by a pretty comfortable margin. Vice President Harris enjoys a 3.5 point lead in the polls in the state of Wisconsin, which is actually wider than it is in Michigan or in Pennsylvania. So I would characterize Wisconsin also as a lean blue state. Despite how it voted in 2020, I think Wisconsin will go to Kamala Harris by a bigger margin than it did for Donald Trump. The Ukrainian Americans and the Arab Americans in Wisconsin aren't really significant communities. There's around 10,000 Ukrainian Americans, 20,000 Arab Americans, not anything that's super significant. Of course, it could tilt the election if it were closer. I don't think it will, though. I don't think that they're as significant as they are in Michigan or Pennsylvania. But the Polish Americans are larger than they are in Michigan. They're around 8.2% of the population. And so they could tilt the election like they usually do in all of the states where they're prevalent. I think that the Polish American vote, like I said for Michigan and Pennsylvania, could play a key role in deciding the election in these three states. Moving on to the Sun Belt. The first state I'm going to talk about is Nevada. So, of course, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are exactly at 270 electoral votes with Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, which was the strategy of the Biden campaign, to win those three states and just lose everything else, because that's how it was going up until Biden dropped out. But now in Nevada, Vice President Harris has really recovered from what the polls were saying. The polls were putting Trump up in the state, but it has gone pretty well for the Democrats in Nevada, and Kamala Harris is currently up by around half a point in the polling averages in the state. This was a state that Biden won by 2.4 points in 2020, and it's the only state of these 7 that Hillary Clinton won in 2016. So I think Nevada will go to the Democrats by a lean margin. Again, the polls don't have it at that, but the polls have a history of underestimating Democrats in the state. In 2022, the governorship actually went to a Republican, but the Senate seat was kept by Catherine Cortez Masto, who won by around 0.77 points, which is not a lot. It's not a very significant margin. But again, this was a year where the Republican Party did very well in the nation as a whole. So I think Nevada will go blue by around what it did in 2020. Maybe a slight decrease, just given how the state has been trending a little bit more Republican every single year. But I don't think that that's enough. I think that the state will still go to Vice President Harris. None of the big three demographics that I was talking about in the Rust Belt states of Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania are really significant in the Sun Belt, at least not to the same degree. So Polish Americans are 1.7% of the population in Nevada. That's not a lot, but it's still something. I don't think that they're significant enough to the degree where they will affect the election in the same way that they will in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Again, not a lot, not significant. I don't think it's worth looking too much into it in these Sun Belt states, but I still think that it is something that could decide the election, more so though in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. So moving on to Arizona. Biden won Arizona by 0.3 points in 2020. It was very close, and it went blue for the first time in more than 20 years. But it was a significant swing from when President Trump won it by 3.5 in 2016. Unlike Nevada, which has gone slightly more Republican over the past few cycles, Arizona has really gone the opposite way. It went from being a safe Republican state to being a really competitive purplish state. The Democratic Party does have a slight advantage in the state. In the 2022 midterms, the Republican Party in Arizona decided to run Kari Lake for governor, which was not a good idea, if I'm being completely frank, because she's not very popular. She was like in Michigan with Tudor Dixon and like in Pennsylvania with Doug Mastriano. She's pretty controversial. She said some inflammatory things throughout her career, and especially after she lost the election and she tried to sue to deny Katie Hobbs, which was her Democratic opponent, the win. So the Democratic Party in Arizona did very well in the midterms, thanks in part to Kari Lake's candidacy for governor. Although her margin of defeat wasn't that small, I do think that it played a very significant role in how the other elections in the state unfolded, and that made the Democrats really do well in a lot of the races in the state. But although the Republicans control the legislative chamber still, the governorship went to the Democrats. Like I said, the Senate seat, which was won by Mark Kelly in a 2020 special election, went to Mark Kelly by around 5 points. So I think Arizona, like Nevada, will go to Kamala Harris by a lean margin. I don't think that it will be as narrow as it was in 2020. I think maybe 1 to 1.5 points. The polls say around 1 point. I think that it will be a bit higher in Arizona and Nevada. The main demographic is Latino voters. Latino voters are very significant in those states, and they will play a key role in determining the election in those two states. Moving on to the eastern side of the country once again with North Carolina and Georgia. I'm going to discuss Georgia first. So Georgia was very, very narrow in 2020. And it went to Biden by 0.23 points, which was honestly surprising. I didn't really expect Georgia to go blue in 2020. I don't think very many people did. It's a state that has heavily favored Republicans over the past few cycles, but it did, which was probably the biggest surprise of the 2020 cycle, maybe besides Arizona. But in the 2022 midterms, the Republican Party did very well and won all of the statewide races, except for one, the Senate seat, which was won by Raphael Warnock, who, like Mark Kelly, had won his seat in a 2020 special election. And that was against Herschel Walker, which was a Trump-endorsed candidate who was also a little bit unpopular with the Georgia population. I think that's part of the reason why it went to Raphael Warnock by 2.8 points, but I don't think that the state currently favors the Democratic Party. I think that the demographics still favor the Republican Party somewhat. If Kamala Harris can run a good campaign, maybe she can narrow it up. But I think if the election were held today, I think Georgia goes to former President Donald Trump by a lean margin, 1 to 1.5 points. He's ahead in the polls by around a point, but no polls have found Kamala Harris in the lead. The state has a very significant African American minority, and that's really what decided the 2020 election. That's what decides a lot of elections in the state of Georgia. But I don't think Georgia will go blue, at least not with how the race is going right now. I don't think Kamala Harris is at an advantage in the state, so I'm going to characterize it as a lean red state. Finally, we have North Carolina. North Carolina is a state that hasn't gone to the Democratic Party since 2008, when it voted for Obama by a very narrow margin, by 0.32 points. But I do think, and I know that this is a take that is kind of out there, but I think North Carolina will go blue in 2024. This is a state that went to Trump by 1.3 points in 2020. And the Democratic Party did somewhat well in the midterms. They did lose the Senate seat, but the Democrats did well in North Carolina's House races and actually gained 2 seats. And for the first time in a very long time, North Carolina's House delegation is evenly split with 7 Republicans and 7 Democrats. The polls in North Carolina are the closest out of any of the 7 states that I've gone into detail of today, but no polls have actually found Trump up, save for one, which found him up by 3 points. All other polls either have it even or give Kamala Harris a slight 1 to 2 point edge. The reason that I think that North Carolina will go blue in 2024 is because of Mark Robinson, who is the current lieutenant governor of the state and is very controversial, to put it mildly, in a lot of different ways. Currently, he's running for governor against his opponent, Democrat Josh Stein. But Mark Robinson has said a lot of things that many people have considered to be homophobic, anti-Semitic, and racist. And he's recently come under very heavy fire for saying that some people need killing. And when asked about his remarks, he defended his remarks, which obviously did not help his case at all. And that has made his polling numbers drop very significantly over the past month and a half or so. It's gone from some polls saying that he's going to win by a narrow margin to most polls finding him down by a very, very large margin, especially considering the state that he's in, which is a state that is always very close. So it will be interesting to see how much Mark Robinson affects the election in North Carolina. I think that it could be somewhat significant, especially in a state as close as this, like Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania, like Tudor Dixon in Michigan, and like Kari Lake in Arizona. I think that in North Carolina, Mark Robinson could have a heavy effect on all the other races in the state, even if it's somewhat limited. Like I've said before, this election is a battle of margins, and the margins in North Carolina are the tightest out of all of these 7 states, at least according to what the polls say. And so if you have a guy like Mark Robinson, who is more controversial than Doug Mastriano, more controversial than Tudor Dixon, and more controversial than Kari Lake, running for governor, running near the top of the ticket, I think that that could have a tilting effect on the state, and that's why I'm characterizing North Carolina, if the election were held today, as a tilt blue state. That's my prediction. I think Kamala Harris and Tim Walz will win 303 electoral votes compared to Donald Trump and JD Vance's 235. There's still plenty of time left, so obviously this could change. But as of right now, this is what I think the state of the race looks like. I'll be making frequent updates to this map. I anticipate about every 2 weeks, just to kind of see how the race has changed. Maybe some states could change from now until November. Of course, there's still more than 2 months to go, which is plenty of time for anything major to happen. But I will be making a Senate map later this week as well. So stay tuned for that. Thank you for watching and have a good day.